I'm Jody Armour. I'm a USC law professor, Roy P. Crocker Professor of Law at USC. I teach criminal law and tort law. Yeah, let's talk about what's in the name and why you're reluctant to use the N-word, because it is so profane and it's transgressive to use the word nigga or nigger in today's everyday discourse, and that's the reason I titled my article, my latest work, Nigga Theory, Contingency, Irony, and Solidarity in the Substantive Criminal Law. I want us to feel uncomfortable. Here's the thing, language is what lawyers are into, right? I say there are 4 word workers in our culture whose bread and butter is word work. That would be writers, poets, lawyers, and rappers, right? Who they live and die on their ability to craft the language and do something with words. And so I've been drawn to the word work of rappers, those kind of street griots, if you will, and appreciated the craft that goes into putting together sentences and phrases in the way they do. And so I tie that into law. In fact, the N-word partly comes from so-called gangster rap. You know, starting with NWA, going through Tupac, Nas, and for that matter, Jay-Z, and you could also throw in a number of other kind of oppositional, politically conscious rappers who use the N-word in the way that Richard Pryor did, in the way that Dave Chappelle did, as terms of art. And for that matter, going back to Huckleberry Finn, Mark Twain, Harriet Beecher Stowe, Uncle Tom's Cabin. The N-word is a jagged-edged word that can harm, can cut, can wound, but used with reticence and care, it can also suture the places where blood flows. You know, the N-word demands, as we've seen in recent news events, that the speaker have a certain social identity. Not just anyone. Paula Deen, for example, can't. And so it's a word in which the social identity of the speaker really matters. And why? Because it's a word that grew out of a particular experience, the experience of slavery, chattel slavery, right? When you would call somebody an N-word, you were otherizing them. You were saying you aren't even fully human. You know, as Dred Scott said, the U.S. Supreme Court said in the Dred Scott decision, blacks have no rights that a white man has to respect, right? So that was where the N-word came from, and then it continued into Jim Crow. And now after Jim Crow, we're looking at the era of mass incarceration, the last 30 years or so. And the question still then becomes, can you, as a member of that group that's been the object of that word, the butt of that word for 350 years, can you reappropriate it, invert it, transvalue it, and use it in your own way, as in an oppositional way, as a term of endearment, in all kinds of ways? You can use it with irony as a member of that group. If you aren't a member of that group, if you haven't been on the receiving end of that word, you can't use it with the same sense of irony. You know, and so I'm not going to use words, for example, that have to do with gender. I would never use the B word, because I'm not from that group. I haven't experienced a woman's discrimination. I walk out at 2 in the morning and I don't think twice about it. And by the same token, the N-word is a valuable cultural resource. A lot of people would like to use it, but right now it is primarily a black cultural property. And people were resentful of that. Some folks say, well, why can't I exploit that word? When Kanye West said, I ain't saying she's a gold digger, but she ain't messing with no broke. That couplet, being able to use that word, probably added hundreds of thousands of sales to his record. So that's a valuable cultural resource that people say, hey, why can't I use Jon Stewart? Why can't I sprinkle around the N-word in my, in my show as punchlines and as spice? Well, the reason has to do with this history that the word comes from, and being an object of that word, and therefore in a position to use it with the kind of irony that someone who hasn't been an object of the word can't. All right, so the meat of nigga theory is this. Chris Rock made a stand-up routine, did a stand-up routine, in which he launched his career with the following line, punchline: I love black people, but I hate niggas. And he had a mostly black audience rolling in the aisles laughing at that punchline. His core definition of a nigga was a black person who's done crime. So when he was saying, I love black people, but I hate niggas, he was saying, I love law-abiding blacks, but I hate black wrongdoers. The pernicious part of that routine, what's wrong with it, is it means that in some of these inner city neighborhoods, up to 90% of young black males are going to wind up in jail, on probation, or on parole at some point in their lives, that up to 90% of our own youth are niggas, right? There should be some pause that anybody feels when it comes to characterizing those kinds of staggering percentages of your community in that way. And so the reason I have formulated nigger theory is to attack that distinction, attack that effort to separate between the deserving good Negroes and the undeserving bad Negroes or so-called niggas. What's hidden in that distinction is, it sounds fair enough. Why are these people making bad choices? That's why they're called bad Negroes, because they're criminals. And these people are making good choices, they're law-abiding Negroes, so why shouldn't you draw a distinction? That distinction hides class bias, because what we see is, in most prisons, the vast majority, over 80% of the inmates are from families below the poverty line. So either people are poor because they're bad, which doesn't make any sense, or bad because they're poor, which makes a lot more sense, that the pressures of poverty drive people to desperate undertakings like crime. But what that means is that since the vast majority of those caught up in the criminal justice system are from poor families, are poor blacks, then when you say, I love black people but I hate niggas, what you're really saying is, I love disproportionately middle-class black people and hate disproportionately truly disadvantaged blacks, who are primarily the ones caught up in the criminal justice system. So for example, in my own neighborhood in View Park, right next to Baldwin Hills, I've had neighbors tell me when my sons were visited by kids from Inglewood and the Jungle and Watts, etc., come and tell me, we don't want Compton up here. And even a sheriff has told my event planner, we don't want South Central up here. So there's a kind of gated community, an economically gated community mentality that is really prevalent in much of not only black middle-class LA, but LA generally, because we're notorious for our gated communities nationally. So the bottom line is, we need to attack the distinction between good and bad on the basis of moral judgments, that one is wicked and one is worthy, and start to recognize that we are all just a tissue of contingencies, that we are all morally at the mercy of luck. That is kind of the conceptual takeaway I draw on philosophy, I draw on cognitive psychology, I draw on linguistic theory to make that point, and to make us all recognize that there but for the grace of God go we.